Absolutely. Well, I want to thank you, Colleen, for putting us on. I really appreciate the opportunity to speak to you all today. My name is Mason Murphy. I grew up in Pendleton, Oregon, and have lived here a majority of my life. And right now I'm the Energy and Environmental Science Program Manager. I just tend to call it the ACE Program Manager. Today I want to chat with you a little bit about tribal sovereignty as it relates to specifically energy. You can see a couple of different main words here that we'll probably get into. So I'm not actually going to give you an overview on what I'm going to get into because it is already here. Land, territory, treaties, infringements, states, and first foods and energy. Okay, one moment. There we go. So first we need to start out with understanding what sovereignty is and what it isn't. The first thing we need to understand is there's both internal and external sovereignty. So sovereignty is really the authority of an entity to govern itself. And so you can imagine that there are both internal issues with a sovereign. So for instance, in CTUIR, for example, there are tribal members, and those tribal members are what you would call the internal group in the sovereign. So that sovereign entity has the authority to govern that internal group. It also has the authority to work externally with other sovereigns. And so this is something that we do frequently with states and federal organizations. So for instance, when we work with the state of Oregon or the state of Washington, that is an example of external sovereignty and us working as sovereigns. So there are three types of sovereignty: directo, de jure, and de facto. So directo is that sovereignty by a right, so example, a treaty right, or by a moral principle, or in this case, the natural law definition is the rule of human action prescribed by the creator and discoverable by the light of reason. In other words, it's pretty easy to tell what the natural law is. And I think the First Foods Mission has done a pretty good job of demonstrating that. Also Tamanwit. De jure, the sovereignty by legal decree or legislative act. This is basically sovereignty in the courts. And then de facto is that sovereignty in practice. And so we'll get into more details of that here shortly. But in general, I want to also outline the three principles of U.S. Indian law. So obviously the treaty is very important. And then there are these three major sections of the Constitution that generally outline that principle. So one of them is that Indians are not to be taxed, that Congress shall have the power to regulate commerce with foreign nations and among the several states and with the Indian tribes. As you can tell, there are three sovereigns listed here: foreign nations as an external sovereign, and then the internal sovereigns of the states and the tribes. At this time, the tribes are probably considered an external sovereign, as were probably the states. The 14th Amendment, Section 2, amends some apportionment of those taxes. And then those three main concepts of tribal sovereignty are the territorial sovereignty, that tribal authority on Indian land is organic, and it's not granted by the state that they're located in. And we have the plenary power doctrine, which demonstrates that Congress has the ultimate authority with regards to Indian tribes, and that the trust relationship is that the federal government has a duty to protect the tribes. And that's really important when we get into looking at, as Althea was discussing, the Hanford site. So in general, I like to think of tribal sovereignty as a cycle. And in the middle of the cycle, per Colleen's suggestion, I put Tamanwit. I kind of had it out over on the side somewhere. You know, Tamanwit is this this natural law, this understanding that we need to work with this natural systems in a way that is reciprocal and that benefits us as well as the environment that we're working with. This is a hard thing that doesn't necessarily come into play in the state. And so what happens in the state is, as we were discussing with directo types of sovereignty, they are done with rights, so constitutions, Bill of Rights, those sorts of policies and framework type governmental documents. So initially, a treaty right in this case is identified as a directo right. A governance activity is performed by the sovereign entity. So let's say in our case of monitoring airsheds, we begin to start monitoring those airsheds. That becomes de facto sovereignty. We continue that activity until it's routine habit and procedure, as we've done with our air program and our air project, and we are continuing to monitor, and we've been doing so for so long that some of the original reasoning behind doing those activities is not known. And so we had to look into understanding why that was originally there. But the important thing is that is de facto sovereignty. You've done it so much until it becomes that habit. Eventually, that governance activity may be questioned legally or procedurally. Basically, somebody comes and says, you don't have the authority to do this governance, this de facto activity. So then it goes into a court system, and that court either upholds or revokes that treaty right, or that, in this case, that activity is either upheld or revoked. And then it's reconfirmed as a treaty right, and that cycle continues. So at first I wanted to take a look at sovereignty and federal policy. I just recently added these two, CERCLA and RCRA. This is the Comprehensive Environmental Response Compensation and Liability Act and the Resource Conservation and Recovery Act. And the only reason I added those is because those are the two main acts that Hanford is forced to adhere to. But as far as sovereignty and federal policy, I really only wanted to focus on these two. The Indian Self-Determination Act and the Executive Order 13175 issued around 2000. So this executive order suggests, it requires each agency of the federal government to develop a plan to engage in consultation, and I left it as a lowercase c for a reason, which I'll talk about later, with tribes that would be affected by a federal undertaking. So DOE has their own specific policy on this. It's called Order 144.1. EPA has their own policy on it. It's called the Policy on Consultation Coordination with Indian Tribes, and BIA as well has theirs. This memorandum, you can click here and we can see what that looks like. A new executive order, 14008, was recently issued by President Biden, and that reaffirms the government's desire to ensure that each agency develop a plan and engage in consultation with tribes. I also wanted to note, since this is a public forum, and that some of you may be wondering, okay, well, how do I help or how do I impact sovereignty? One of the best ways you can do it is vote. Vote for candidates that align with the acts that you want to see passed. How else can you help? You can personally help expand tribal sovereignty by sending a letter to Congress. If something just doesn't sit right with you, send a letter to your congressman or congresswomen. You have a direct link to those people, and you've already voted for them. So keep up the good work. Sovereignty is strengthened through self-determination. And what I mean by self-determination, I mean literally just doing it. Indian Self-Determination Act gives tribes the ability to strengthen sovereignty through self-governance. It does this in a couple ways, but one of the biggest ways it does it is providing funding. I didn't put it here, but I did color this green because it is important to remember that money is critical to sovereignty. One thing I found interesting while I was looking into some of this is that tribes who fail to self-govern but continue to remind the federal government of their trust and treaty obligations have generally made the least progress towards expanded sovereignty. I think that's important, but in other words, just do it. So to expand sovereignty, we have to get into a position of continually exerting these self-governance capabilities. It's also important to recognize if you wanted to burn on a non-burn day and we say, no, it's not a good day to burn, the reason we're doing that is not to be a thorn in your side, but rather to continue to expand that sovereignty, because we want to make sure that at the end of the day that the tribe is regulating its airshed and not necessarily the city, the state, or another federal agency that may or may not have in-depth understandings. So I wanted to take a look at sovereignty at the technical level. So you kind of get an understanding of what these activities look like as we perform them on the ground. So EPA Clean Air Act and the Federal Air Rules for Reservations were both important acts that allowed CTUIR to be treated as a state for regulatory purposes. And as you know, states are sovereign entities. And so once you get treatment as a state, that's as good as sovereignty. And so you can see I put a risk of the level of sovereignty. So green being the lowest risk, our interactions with the EPA, we are very much treated as a sovereign. We have authority by federal regulations. We're treated like a state for monitoring airshed, establishing burn permits, and we have financial assistance agreements with EPA to strengthen our regulatory abilities. As you can see, the DOE Environmental Management Hanford Cleanup section, a little bit in the medium to higher risk. The original tri-party agreement, which is the agreement that forces DOE to achieve its milestones, didn't include the local tribes. Even though all three of the different tribes, the Yakima, Nez Perce, and CTUIR, all have ceded lands into the Hanford site. The Nuclear Waste Policy Act provided a mandate for funding to tribes, which was great. We don't like unfunded mandates per the unfunded mandates rule. And it provided that funding for the duration of nuclear siting activities. And it provided roughly $1 million per affected tribe, or $3 million per tribe per site. In this case, it would be roughly $1 million per tribe. That act came out in 1984, I believe. And so, correct me if I'm wrong, but if the inflation was applied to that number should look more like $3 million per year. Something we're currently trying to work on with DOE. Government-to-government consultation, again, lowercase c, underlined for a reason, is present but needs expansion. One of the only positive things at the DOE site is our financial assistance agreements, and we do have them. They aren't, maybe this actually should be like a light green. And the reason, I want to explain the reason for this lowercase consultation, because this is a very serious issue, I think, in general with the federal government and tribes, is that the federal government tends to view consultation as an informational session where if you were present and you heard information or saw a presentation that you were consulted with. The tribes and most anyone else who actually understands or knows the dictionary definition for the word consultation understands that that is an iterative process where we are both working together to a final solution. So Hanford is really a great example of the challenges of sovereignty and the importance of the tribes in exercising de facto sovereignty. And you can see the other two. You can see the three agencies: U.S. Department of Energy, Washington Ecology, and US EPA as the main regulatories of that TPA, tri-party agreement. Past Hanford activities, 1939 to roughly 2011-ish. I mean, that's not exactly right, but depends on what you count. So in general, you look at it, there was this new technology to save the world, or circa 1940s, right? We have this technology that can suddenly stop all the wars and finish the question of who should be in power, I suppose, or who can control the narrative. Just like with a lot of other energy technologies, the ability to develop plutonium was new, and it was not fully known what the consequences would be. So you can see here, there's the Columbia River, and here is one of the early facilities for developing that radioactive material. Here is a puck of plutonium. Here's the periodic table piece. Here's a landfill full of who knows what. And then one of the major current risks at the Hanford site right now, and one that Althea was talking about, was the iodine-129 that's moving through in a plume through the groundwater. It's no longer in the Central Plateau. It is actually moving east towards the river, and it looks like it might be there in the next model. So it's definitely a concern, and she was very correct on it having a half-life of roughly 15 million years. It's also very active in the environment, so it moves around pretty quickly. It's a concern that we're watching. As you can see, Waste was stored in single-shelled tanks below ground, and that waste eventually began to leak out. And you can see here that if you stacked up on a football field all of the waste, it would be a third of a football field high, maybe almost a half of a football field high, and then one across. And this is the full profile of what that would look like in waste. So some current Hanford activities, I just kind of pasted up here, the main 3 activities from their Hanford 5-year plan. So ultimately they have the tank waste cleanup, the central plateau cleanup, and then the river corridor cleanup. In this map to the right, you can see the central plateau is in this middle area that's called 200 area. It's the 200 West and 200 East area. This is where a majority of the really toxic compounds were handled. And in this case, the 200 West area is where the plutonium was actually finished. So it was one of the most contaminated sites. Up here to the top, in the top, you can see I've shown a plume reduction of hexavalent chromium. That was the same contaminant from, well, we don't have to worry about that. Main point, you can see here from 2011 to 2018, a significant reduction in this plume size. One could argue it might have just gone to the river, but what you don't see here is that in 2013, a pump and treat was installed in this area that significantly reduced the overall contamination. And the way the pump and treats work is similar to this picture here. There's an injection well. They'll pull up water and then water it onto the surface, and then just keep watering those contaminants in or pull the contaminants out, filter them, and then rewater that fresh drinking water back in. Okay, so some of our current activities at the Hanford site. We're doing some environmental monitoring, use of sampling tools and artificial mimics of first foods that uptake targeted contaminants at a documented rate. So we're monitoring resources for protection against known threats. And this is a necessary element of de facto sovereignty. We're also doing some environmental research. We're performing scientific studies to improve our understanding of how environmental threats affect first foods. Or their access and availability. Some of the interesting work that we've seen at the site, and we will be probably researching here soon, are the various PFAS, which are the fluorinated compounds that can concentrate up to 1,000 times in fish tissues and are genotoxic. In other words, they can affect your genome and cause mutations in your genes. If we look at we've also been looking at the fate and transport. In other words, what happens to the chemicals when they get in the environment and where do they end up? It's really important as things begin to bioaccumulate to understand where they accumulate. We've been developing our long-term stewardship control technologies. One of the first foods at the site, istis, is a edible Opuntia cactus that's very medicinally important, but it also serves as a protector for cultural sites, and we have installed this in areas where we want to reduce traffic. It's also a necessary element of sovereignty to provide a way for institutional controls or preventing the flow of human interaction or human traffic to a certain area. It's what the Hanford site claims they're going to do for eternity on the Hanford site, but it's pretty hard for an institutional control to last beyond the institution. And since the United States is such a young country, it's hard to predict that it will last for as long as these contaminants. The tri-party agreement milestone tracking, the Hanford's regulatory schedule is the tri-party agreement. And so we make sure that we monitor that, and to get any sort of movement on our initiatives, we need to leverage our relationship capital to influence the TPA regulators. One of those regulators is the Department of Ecology in Washington. And so we don't, again, this is another example of poor sovereignty abilities at the site currently, is that we have to work through other sovereigns or where we have to influence other sovereigns to get the outcomes that we're seeking. So that's that sovereign to sovereign. In other words, sovereign recognized sovereign. We're also working on developing a Hanford air quality monitoring plan. and then commenting on technical documents occasionally. Okay, so I'm just going to end here on this slide. Sovereignty is critical to climate adaptation. So if you look at this image, this is actually a map of the region of the Pacific Northwest from about 15,000 years ago. So this was during the Missoula floods. And as you can see in blue here, these light blue is where all of the basins that were filled up after this glacial dam melted, and the entire Missoula Lake was able to empty in a very short period of time. As you can see, a lake basically filled up what is now the entire Hanford site. And the only place that it did not cover seems to be Lalik or Rattlesnake Mountain. And other than that, most of these other areas were underwater. And as you can see, the tribes have clearly been dealing with climate change for the last 15,000 years. And because of this, sovereignty itself is critical. And so I could just leave it there. If anyone's interested, I have a DOE vision for the future of Hanford. And I'll just spoil the surprise right now and say it is largely revolved around energy. Thank you.